time, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm here to introduce Ben. Ben was born in Karachi. He's born in Karachi, but his family moved to the United Kingdom in 1979, the year in which Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Great timing, Ben. Great. Ben was educated at Rugby School and Cambridge University, after which he became an analyst in the corporate finance department of the Lehman Brothers. And I suspect he was there in September 1992, on Black Wednesday, soon to be known as White Wednesday, when sterling was wonderfully ejected from the exchange rate mechanism. In 1994, Ben became managing director of a property development company, and 6 years later he formed his own property fund company, First Property Group plc, which is now quoted on the London stock market with a capitalisation of £45 million. Ben is still the chief executive, and it operates in the UK, Poland and Romania. In June 2019, Ben became an MEP for the Brexit Party, being first on the party's London list. In the Parliament, appropriately, he served on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. And I must congratulate Ben as having the highest outside earnings of any member of Parliament. Now, it's a record I held briefly in the House of Commons, but that's not the reason I'm congratulating him for being number one for outside earnings. It meant that Ben had no interest in seeking to maximise his income from the European Parliament itself. Unlike many of the other members of the European Parliament, he was not on the make and on the take at the taxpayer's expense. So it's excellent that you have those means, Ben, and I always believe the best parliamentarians are those that have a certain degree of independence. Now, Ben has considerable expertise in the field of future trade relationships for the United Kingdom, now that we have left the European Union. And he is featured prominently as a columnist for the Daily Telegraph on this subject. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please give a very warm welcome to Ben Habib.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a privilege it is for me to be addressing fellow Brexiteers. I think you're all Spartans. We're all Spartans. You've been here from 11 a.m. You're skipping England versus Wales, so you must be entirely committed to the Brexit cause. Thank you very much for inviting me and listening to me this afternoon. Testimonials have been paid to a number of people on Brexit, and I myself would like to say that Brexit would not possibly have happened had it not been for Boris Johnson, and we all owe him a great debt of gratitude. We also owe a great debt of gratitude to the ERG, who held, especially the Spartans, who held Mrs. May to account when she was trying to sell us down the drain. But there is someone who has been conspicuously overlooked today in his contribution to Brexit. And even though the ERG tried hard to get rid of Mrs. May, actually you'll recall that the Conservative Party refused to let her go in December 2018. And she wouldn't have gone, she didn't resign until the 24th of May, which was the day after the Euro elections, when she knew her game was up. And the Brexit Party got more votes than the Labour Party and the Conservative Party put together. And the person I want to thank, and I suppose I know we're being live streamed, I suppose he's watching England versus Wales at the moment, but the person I'd like to thank is Nigel Farage, without whom there would be no Brexit. Now, I've been a vocal critic of obviously Mrs. May's withdrawal agreement, but also I'm afraid of the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement and political declaration with which it is associated. And what I want to do now is to go through some of the key points of the withdrawal agreement and the bearing they have on the future relationship with the European Union during the negotiating period of 11 months, or we've got 10 months left now, before we exit at the end of this year. And I'm going to be a bit of a Debbie Downer to start with. Yes, indeed, we did Brexit on the 31st of January, but actually we did not become an independent nation. Far be it for me to disagree with Marc Francois, but actually we are not yet an independent nation. We remain part of the single market, we are in the customs union, and we are still subject to all the laws made in Brussels and the supremacy of the ECJ. We will not become an independent nation until we exit on the 31st of December 2020. And it's not just about free trade, this negotiation that's happening this year. It's about gaining our independence. So please keep alert during the next 11 months. And what I've done with a colleague of mine, Brian Monteith, who has some editorial experience and I have a little cash to make it work, is set up something called Brexit Watch. And we're going to be keeping an eye on the progress of negotiations during this period. And I've tried to distill down the trajectory of negotiations into 10 key points. We started with about 25, but I think everyone's got ADHD. And you've got to keep it simple and you've got to stay focused. So just moving to the first key issue with, I call it the Brexit Barometer. It's rather good, isn't it? The first key point, can you see that, everyone? No. Can we make that a bit bigger? Does that work? No. Okay. Well, that's a great shame, but I will talk to it nevertheless. The key thing. Oh, that's a good plan. Lateral thinking. Can you see that? I'll read it to you. I'll explain it to you as we go through it. The first point, which is absolutely critical to me, is ensuring that we are not stuck in a level playing field with the European Union. What that effectively would mean, and I can explain that in one sweeping statement. You know, we didn't leave the EU in order to rejoin the EU, and being in a level playing field would mean that we would be stuck in its lunar orbit forever. But there's a much more pressing economic reason to get out of the level playing field, and it's evidenced by the results of the level playing field, their own laws. And I want to talk very briefly about the state of the European Union, particularly the Eurozone. A nation's interest rates are a bit like a human being's heart rate. If interest rates are too high, the patient or the individual is likely to have a heart attack. If interest rates are too low, the individual is likely to have heart failure. We are now 10 years on from the credit crunch, and for all its policies, all its lawmaking, all its initiatives, interest rates in the Eurozone are still in negative territory. They're sitting at minus 0.5%. What that tells you in one metric is that the European Union's economy is fundamentally broken. And if that isn't enough to evidence that their level playing field doesn't work for them, the ECB, the European Central Bank, which indulged, against Germany's great chagrin, indulged in quantitative easing to buoy the economy during the credit crunch, owns $5.5 trillion worth of Eurozone government debt. That is 40% of the GDP of the Eurozone. The Fed, which has been pretty loose with its monetary policy, owns less US treasuries. It owns about $5 trillion worth of US treasuries. It owns less US treasuries than the ECB does in absolute terms. And in relative terms, it only owns 25% of the GDP of the United States of America. And the United Kingdom actually is in the healthiest of all positions. It only owns £375 billion worth of government gilts, which is about 15% of our GDP. So optimistically, we're in a relatively good position. And the other thing people may or may not know is that even though we're 10 years away from the credit crunch, even though we've had 10 years of recovery, the ECB, before the coronavirus kicked off, is already indulging in more QE. Did anyone know that in this audience?
Yes.
Okay, 2 people did. They're buying 20 billion euros worth of government debt every month. Their economy is on its back. And if that wasn't bad enough, fiscally, the average debt in the Eurozone, the average government debt in the Eurozone is at 90% of GDP. So they've got no monetary headroom to respond, for example, to the coronavirus. They've got no fiscal headroom because they're all over-leveraged. Debt to GDP ratio in Greece is 180%. In Italy, it's 130%. And France, it's 100%. France is as good as bust. And if you want to get that at a human level, unemployment in the Eurozone is at 6%. In the UK, it's half that. Youth unemployment, someone mentioned youth unemployment earlier. Youth unemployment in Greece is 40%. In Italy, it's 30%. In Spain, it's 30%. If you want a recipe to break peace, it's to leave the youth unemployed. So, ladies and gentlemen, they are in deep trouble. But they're not happy. They're not happy with the extent of the trouble into which they've got themselves. They now want to punish themselves with this new green agenda to be half carbon. They want to halve their carbon emissions by 2030, and they want to be carbon neutral by 2050. Carbon emissions neutral by 2050. What von der Leyen has said is that that's going to cost them €1 trillion. No way is that going to cost them €1 trillion. That's going to cost them a multiple of €1 trillion. Our own government, one of Mrs. May's passing last legacies was to sign this country up. After she knew she was leaving, she signed this country up to zero net carbon emissions by 2050, and our Treasury forecasts that it's going to cost us £1 trillion. So if you think that a 65 million pound population country is going to require £1 trillion to get it carbon neutral, it's going to be a multiple of trillions to get the European Union carbon neutral. And if that wasn't bad enough, we're leaving the European Union, so they're going to lose 12 billion net, 18 billion gross per annum of our contribution, which is going to give them an existential crisis. So, ladies and gentlemen, the last thing we want to do is to be stuck in the lunar orbit of the European Union. We have to break out of the level playing field for our own sake. I'm going to now we're in the rhetorical phase of the battle with the EU over these trade negotiations. Actions have yet to really be discovered, and I'm going to mark the government on rhetoric, and then I'm going to mark them on action. On rhetoric, I would give Boris Johnson 6. You might be thinking, that's a bit low, Ben. He's been pretty on his front feet. David Frost has been on his front foot. Everyone's been speaking about leaving the level playing field. Well, I'm going to give him 6, because actually the political declaration into which he signed this country, paragraph 77, please read it, says that we will sign up to a level playing field, to their state aid laws, their competition laws, their environmental laws, their tax laws, as they are stated at the end of the transition period. That is the commitment we have made to them. Moreover, unless he deals with Northern Ireland, and I'm just going to talk about Northern Ireland for a second, unless he deals with Northern Ireland now with incredible, robust political will, there is no way he can give effect to his rhetoric about stepping away from the level playing field. And the reason I say that is that the way he got us out of the backstop was to put Northern Ireland into the Customs Union. So 1.8 million British people are already stuck in the EU, possibly in perpetuity. And that treaty is not something that comes into place at the end of this year. That treaty is not conditional on the free trade agreement that we may or may not sign this year. The Northern Irish Protocol is internationally binding law right now. Northern Ireland is part of the European Union's customs union. And therefore, it is stuck in that level playing field. Moreover, Northern Ireland is condemned to aligning with European Union state aid law as it stands at the moment and as it will evolve in the future. That's called dynamic alignment. That's something that Macron's been pushing and we've been verbally resisting. But actually part of the United Kingdom is stuck in dynamic alignment with the European Union. So I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, Boris gets 0 for action. And he gets 0 for action because of the Northern Irish Protocol. The only way out of this commitment is for the United Kingdom to unilaterally and in breach of that agreement repudiate it. And that's what he has to do. The next really critical thing is to break away from the Court of Justice of the European Union, or ECJ as we know it. While we're in the transition period, we are subject to the ECJ just like any other member state. But what's invidious about the political declaration is that most of it is done under European Union law. And paragraph 131, again, please look it up, of the political declaration states unequivocally that in the event of a dispute which involves a European Union matter, and virtually the entire political declaration is a European Union matter, the European Court of Justice will be the ultimate arbiter. So that's a bad place from which to start. Nevertheless, I'm going to give him 6 on rhetoric because he said no way will any part of the, if you look at the negotiating mandate that was released on the 25th of February, no way will any part of the UK be subject to the ECJ. But I'm afraid, again, he gets 0 on action because Northern Ireland is always going to be subject to the supremacy of the ECJ. So unless we think Northern Ireland is not part of the United Kingdom, there is no mechanism by which we can exit the ECJ's supremacy. He has to, I'm repeating myself, he has to repudiate that commitment. He hasn't done it and he should get on with doing it. Ensuring we have control of our borders, same kind of thing. Rhetoric, 5, he's prepared to negotiate with the European Union over fishing, and actually letting their fishing boats into our waters is, in fact, not being very strong on our borders. And of course, on action, he gets 0. Again, I'm afraid, because of the Northern Irish Protocol. There is a border, we can't see it right now, but there is already a border down the Irish Sea. Any goods that once we leave the transition, we don't see it now because we are in the single market. We're not experiencing it yet. But when we leave the single market, unless we have repudiated that treaty, whatever any parliamentarian, conservative government minister, trade expert says, there will be customs declarations going back and forth across the Irish Sea. It is the only way to maintain the integrity of the UK's customs area, and it is a prerequisite for the UK to have trade deals with other countries. Otherwise, there would be a backdoor into Great Britain, because actually they get into Northern Ireland anyway. There'd be a backdoor into Great Britain of goods from countries with whom we don't have a trade agreement, such as Japan, and they could flow anywhere. And the US won't strike a trade deal with us unless we can close down that Irish Sea border. So there will be customs checks. You cannot get away from it. The rhetoric is great, but I can only give him 5 and it's 0 for action, because we have a border right down the middle of the United Kingdom at the moment. Ensuring the next manifesto pledge and the next critical component of Brexit is getting control of our cash. We haven't got control of our cash yet, ladies and gentlemen. We are still paying £1 billion a month over net. Net. I'm not talking about gross figures, net. £1 billion a month to the European Union. And you might think, okay, well, that's going to end at 31st December. That will end at the 31st of December if we exit the transition period. But what won't end is the joint and several guarantee to which we have signed up for up to 500 billion euros worth of liabilities of the European Investment Bank. That is a joint and several guarantee. And if Europe continues down the path it is going, we are going to have a monumental credit crunch in Europe. It's over-indebted, it has no monetary headroom, it's embarking on this green agenda to which I've referred, and there is going to be problems in the Eurozone, significant problems. And most of the lending of the EIB is to European entities. And we are signed up to this joint and several guarantee. So the other thing that the Prime Minister has to do is repudiate that guarantee. So on rhetoric, again, the best I can give him is 6, because we haven't got control of our cash and we won't be able to get it unless he repudiates that guarantee. And on action, I've given him 3. Actually, I could have had him down at 0 there, but we will get some. We will get some cash control. We'll get the bulk of our cash control. It will be this joint and several. That's why I gave him 3, because we will have most control, but there will still be a residual liability. Then the next issue, which is of totemic importance. The next issue, which is of totemic importance to the British people and to our coastal communities as an independent coastal state, is fishing. Now, it is only 0.7% of GDP, but try and tell that to someone who's had their livelihood stolen from them. Try and tell that to the people who voted for Boris Johnson because he said he would take back complete control of our fishing waters. It's very, very important. I've given him 6 on rhetoric there because that is what he has said. Unfortunately, the political declaration to which I referred before, paragraph 73, commits us to making quotas available into the long term. Now, it's slightly ambiguous, and he may be able to exit that commitment from the political declaration. The European Union want us to sign up completely to an ongoing form of the common fisheries policy, and he must not do that. I've put NA here because it's work in progress. No commitment to military interoperability. This is a horrendous subject from my perspective. We were told repeatedly in the run-up to the referendum that actually the European Union's not looking to form an army. And one of the things I was a sub on the budgetary committee. Actually, the economics committee was my main endeavour, but I was a sub on the budgetary committee, and 2 figures jumped out at me when I looked at the multi-annual financial plan for 21 to 27, the 2021 to 2027 budget for the European Union. And the 2 figures that jumped out were 21 billion euros to be spent on a European defence force. That's a 10,000 strong European Union badged, not independent member state badges, European Union badged force, which will protect the borders of the European Union. And 13 billion euros to be spent on weapons development. And, ladies and gentlemen, before I get to the paragraph, I have to tell you that another one of Mrs. May's legacies was to sign us into the European Defence Union structure in September 2017. That was after the referendum result. She was signing us up into, I have to read it because there's so many forms of the European Union security architecture. She signed us into the EU Security and Defence Implementation Plan, which is effectively the entire architecture, European Defence Action Plan, and the EU's Global Strategy, September 2017. That is in British law at the moment. And under paragraph 102 of the political declaration, we as a nation have to consider, and this is an important bit of wording, that concession in the wording that Boris Johnson got, because actually under her deal, we were committed to it, but under his deal, we have to consider military interoperability with the European Union's defence architecture. Now, what the Prime Minister needs to do, to be fair to the Prime Minister, our negotiating mandate makes no reference to defence, because he has said openly that defence is a matter which we can cooperate on outside any formal agreement. Of course, that's common sense. But there are two things he needs to do. He needs to declare unequivocally that we will not be part of any military interoperability. We're not talking about cooperation here. We're talking about integration. That's where the EU wants to go. Our defence and the defence of Europe is through NATO, not through PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. And the other thing he needs to do, which he hasn't done, is to unwind these laws. Mrs. May has signed us into these laws. He should unwind it. Why are we waiting? Why hasn't Parliament unpicked these three laws? We should be exiting them straight away. It sends a strong signal to the European Union. So I put non-applicable there because still work in progress. Planning for no-deal exit. Now, what our media and Remainers did so well during the referendum campaign, disaster for the nation. And they won that argument. And I think one of the reasons, or the main reason, that the Prime Minister was forced into some kind of withdrawal agreement was because the British people have been made petrified of leaving the EU without a deal. And one of the challenges the Prime Minister faces is to change that perception, because it's not true. You know, one glance, as I mentioned, across the channel informs you that staying close to them is the disaster route, because they're in deep, deep trouble. We need to get out ASAP, and we need to get out cleanly. And that message needs to, so we need no-deal planning. We need an optimistic vision of the United Kingdom in a post-Brexit world. And that, I'm afraid, is another failing, a huge failing on Mrs. May's part, and I haven't seen any positive, coherent vision of the United Kingdom through the prism of Brexit as an independent nation. We've heard about putting 20,000 more police officers on the street. We've heard about employing 50,000 more nurses. But what is his no-deal vision for this country? Because no deal is very firmly on the cards. And if we want a good deal, as we all know, the only way to get it is if we're prepared to leave without one. So we have to have a vision of what no deal means. And very briefly, this is my vision. We take back 12 billion a year net, rising to 18 billion. I would keep some of the 6 billion kickbacks going on. I would keep CAP going for a while, and I'd keep some of the other subsidies going to transition out those organisations in this country who have had the benefit of that money coming back from the EU. But I would have 18 billion effectively coming back into UK coffers. I would be a tariff-imposing United Kingdom. I wouldn't be shy. Part of our no-deal planning last year under Mrs. May was to waive tariffs on 88% of goods coming from the EU. That's like surrendering. That's like saying, okay, in the event of no deal, we're not going to levy tariffs on you so you can have complete access to our markets. We run a £100 billion deficit with the EU. We need to be a tariff-imposed. If we don't get a deal, we've got to be a tariff-imposing nation. And if we were to be a tariff-imposing nation, our consumers would be paying 13 billion into government coffers. And consumers on the continent would be paying 5 billion into tariffs that way round, because of the huge deficit that we carry, we would actually have a net surplus of 8 billion. So our government would be in a position to take the 13 billion and to compensate our exporters who are having to suffer this extra 5 billion of tariffs. We'd be in a perfect position to do that. We could transition, give them a sort of interim transition rearrangement to come to terms with tariffs, protect our exporters, and absolutely take European Union exporters to the cleaners. And we should be doing it. The other thing that we've got to do, and I'm quite concerned about the direction of travel of the government, because it seems they haven't really cottoned on to the fact that we've got to be a low tax, lowly regulated, or at least we've got to jettison a hell of a lot of the regulations that are imposed on us by the European Union. And we've got to jettison some of the financial regulations. We've got to get rid of MiFID II. You may not know this, but under Basel and under Solvency II, the first isn't a European Union measure, but the second is, under Basel and Solvency II, there are no capital adequacy requirements for loans made to European member state governments. So in other words, they regard the Greek government and the German government as equal credits and risk-free. It's absolutely absurd. So what we need to be doing is having a vision of a no-deal Brexit United Kingdom where we are we're 31 billion up because we're not paying the money and we're imposing tariffs. We cut corporation tax so that our businesses do well and we attract new businesses to the UK. We cut VAT so that our consumers have more money in their pockets. We cut tax on fuel so that our consumers have more money in their pockets. We deregulate and we become a highly competitive fighting force. Actually, the image is so captivating, so attractive, that I would jettison all negotiations with the EU and I would simply go no deal. But the government has said in its negotiating mandate that it won't even start planning for no deal until June. If it looks like we're not going to get a deal, we should be planning for it now. Every penny spent on it now is a penny well spent. Action. I can't give him more than 2 because he's not taking any action. He's not going to take any action until June. And that's leaving it way too late. The next point plays into, I'm going to skip this point really quickly, a positive vision of post-Brexit. Now, I think the no-deal vision is the best vision of the UK. Of course, there are other visions that we can have depending on the kind of deal we get. But I think I've made that point well enough already. The next 2 points, you'll be pleased to hear, I give Boris quite good marks on them. Implementation of a skills-based immigration policy. I give him 10 on rhetoric, 8 on action, and I hope Pretty holds her position. I hope she has the protective blanket of the Prime Minister. And I give him 10 on the next point as well, which is not to extend the transition period before after December 2. I give him 10 on rhetoric, and I give him 8 on action. He can technically reverse the decision, but I think it's a terribly positive, amazingly positive thing he's done to say that we will not be going beyond it. And so in total, I give the Prime Minister 63 on rhetoric. He'd instantly make that go to about 93 if he were to repudiate the Northern Irish Protocol. Rhetoric would go to 93. And at the moment on action, he's only got 24 out of 100, I'm afraid. There's a lot of work he has to do there. Now, before I go, I wanted to just say 2 very quick things. I have set up something called Brexit Watch. This Brexit Barometer will be updated every week on Brexit Watch. It's brexit-watch.org. Brexit-watch.org. And you can, this isn't up there yet, but it will be. And the last thing I want to say is that the EU will do all it can to give us a bad deal. We need to be utterly robust during this next 11 months. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.